Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something I think a lot of us feel sometimes. That sense of not quite being your true self.
Yeah, that's right. It's a really common feeling. We've been looking at this great conversation from Vietcetera between Das Simin and Thuy Min.
Part of their Bonthon series.
Exactly. And the title, Kong La Chin Min, it just translates directly to not being oneself. Really captures it.
So our mission here, for you listening, is to kind of unpack that. How can you tell if you're feeling this way? What sort of things influence it?
And crucially, what are some first steps maybe you can take to get back in touch with, your authentic self?
Okay, so let's dive in. Where do we start? Those first clues. What does it feel like when you're not quite aligned?
Well, a big one is often this feeling of not being free, like you're being controlled somehow or led.
Right, or maybe you find it really hard to make decisions that feel truly yours.
Exactly. And there's this sense often that you have to be, well, some other version of you, someone else almost.
Yeah, playing a role. And you mentioned looking at the source material. They talked about where this often starts, right? Like early on.
Oh, yeah. Tu Simin Nim and Thuy Min really highlighted parental influence. And look, it's often well-intentioned,
Okay.
but parents can sometimes project their own dreams, their own expectations onto their kids. Wanting them to be a doctor or an engineer. The classic paths.
Uh-huh. So the pressure starts early.
It can. And maybe a key thought here for you is unintentional parental pressure, even when it comes from love, can sow those early seeds of inauthenticity. It prioritizes what others expect over what you might actually feel called to do.
That makes sense. And they also mentioned cultural factors,
Mm.
especially in Eastern cultures, that expectation for kids to follow what parents suggest.
Yeah, that pressure can be quite strong, even if it doesn't quite match up with the child's own, leanings.
Which brings up a really tricky question for you, listening. Can you actually live a happy life on a path someone else picked?
It's complicated, isn't it? Where's that line between genuine happiness and just accepting things?
Right, because Thuy Min shared that story about ending up in a literature class by mistake.
Yeah, and it led her to journalism, a career she found fulfilling. So sometimes it can work out unexpectedly.
But the point is knowing the difference, isn't it? Is it real alignment, or are you just taking the easy route because it feels,
Yeah,
well, comfortable enough?
exactly. It's amazing how subtle those influences can be. Society's expectations, those little voices inside your head pushing you off track, even when things seem fine on the surface.
So this whole idea of the self, it makes you wonder, is it even a fixed thing we're trying to get back to?
Well, that's another fascinating point they raised. The idea is that the self, or maybe the ego, it's not static. It's not set in stone.
Okay.
It's constantly changing, shaped by our experiences, who we interact with, even like spending time in nature.
So it's more fluid.
Exactly. So maybe a key takeaway here is embrace that your identity isn't fixed. Authenticity might be more about flowing with that change rather than sticking to one rigid idea.
Like a river, maybe? Always changing based on the landscape.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, not a statue.
Okay, that helps frame it differently. So why do you think this topic, being authentic, not being yourself, why does it feel so relevant right now?
Good question. The hosts in the source conversation speculated maybe there's a bit of a societal shift happening.
A shift away from,
Maybe away from just chasing external things, success, money, status, and more towards inner exploration, people wanting to understand themselves better.
yeah, I can see that. They used a lyric, didn't they?
They did, from Trin Kung Sin. Too
Which means roughly.
tired, these legs seep a chair to rest. It really captures that feeling when the outer chase just leaves you feeling empty.
It highlights that need to listen inwards, doesn't it? When the external stuff just isn't cutting it anymore.
Definitely. And going back to those early influences, the conversation really dug into how that parental guidance, even with the best intentions, can sometimes lead to this loss of autonomy.
Right, you lose a bit of your own steering wheel.
Yeah. Especially, they noted, in some Asian cultures where dictating a child's path is more common, it can kind of stop kids from figuring out who they actually are.
So they end up becoming like little versions of their parents.
Or just trying really hard to fit into that good kid, successful person mold that's been set for them. And it means they might suppress their natural interests, their quirks.
And the fear of what others think must play a huge role.
Huge. That fear of judgment. It stops kids from showing their true colors, and then it becomes a habit, being inauthentic just to get by.
They had that example, right? The little boy in the shoes.
Yeah, the 6-year-old wanting pink shoes, and his peers made fun of him, so he just stopped wanting them, buried that preference.
Wow, those small moments add up.
They really do. They contrasted it with like a younger kid instinctively pulling a funny face to get attention, showing how early that conditioning can start, shaping how we present ourselves.
Okay, so this leads to a really important point for everyone listening. When do you need to, take the reins back? Move past those early influences and own your life.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They talked about Tassiminian's own story. He apparently told his parents quite young that he needed to make his own choices.
Really? Even if it meant facing difficulties.
Yeah, he was willing to face hardship for that, right? It's a powerful idea. Ultimately, you are responsible for your own life.
And it seems like he stuck to that. Even later, with spiritual teachers.
Apparently so. Even when his mentors disagreed with his path, he stayed true to what he felt was right for him. It really drives home that personal accountability.
Strong stance to take.
It is. And they also gave some advice, like for young couples facing parental disapproval about their relationship.
That was the advice.
Basically, focus on the genuine love you have and persevere respectfully. Try to win them over gradually rather than making drastic reactive choices just because they disapprove.
That sounds like mature advice. So there's a contrast then between people who assert themselves early.
Yeah, and those who perhaps become overly dependent, they use this interesting term, Bambi boys.
Bambi boys, like the deer.
Exactly, suggesting individuals who haven't really developed that strong inner sense of self, like a young, vulnerable deer, and then they struggle later when life throws challenges their way because they haven't figured out who they are outside of that dependency.
That dependency can really hold you back from finding yourself. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about influences now? The digital world.
Ah, yes, this was a big part of their discussion. The influence of the internet, social media, it's maybe more subtle than direct parental pressure, but potentially just as powerful in making us feel inauthentic.
How so?
Well, there's this constant feeling of performing, isn't there? Curating this perfect version of yourself online for everyone to see.
Yeah, the highlight reel.
Exactly. And that can create this huge gap between who you project online and how you actually feel inside.
It's strange because you can feel incredibly connected online, but also deeply lonely.
Precisely. They mentioned some lyrics by Le Cat Tronc Lee that apparently capture that feeling modern isolation despite all the online connection.
Interesting. And did they talk about how we use the internet too? Like for escape?
Yeah, things like binge watching, endless gaming. Especially, they noted, during the pandemic, it can become a way to avoid dealing with ourselves, amplifying that disconnect.
So what are the signs? How might you know if this digital age inauthenticity is affecting you?
They shared some experiences from people visiting Tassimin Neem's Institute, things that seem small but speak volumes, like people wearing T-shirts saying, "Take me home."
Wow. Like a cry for help almost. A desire to get back to something real.
Exactly, a symbol of wanting to return to a more authentic state. And stories of people who had the successful life, lawyers, doctors, but they just walked away from it all.
Because they felt empty.
Yeah, searching desperately for purpose, sometimes unfortunately turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms. But underneath it all was this deep desire to find their real selves after feeling let down by what society told them they should want.
That's powerful. It really shows the cost of living inauthentically for too long.
It does. And they definitely linked things like excessive internet use, exposure to really negative or violent content online, and unhealthy peer groups online as factors that can erode that sense of self.
Making it harder and harder to find your way back to that, innocent, genuine core you started with.
Exactly. It gets buried under layers of performance and external noise.
Okay, it sounds kind of heavy. So how do you start coming back? What's the path back to authenticity?
The absolute first step, they stressed, is just acknowledgement. Accepting where you are right now. Even if it's painful, even if you recognize you've been inauthentic, you can't change what you don't acknowledge.
So honesty with yourself is key.
Crucial. And creating a safe space internally where you can be vulnerable, where you can look at yourself without harsh judgment.
And this is where mindfulness comes in, right? I hear that term a lot.
Yes, exactly. They presented mindfulness as a really useful tool. It's about learning to observe your thoughts, your emotions, without getting totally tangled up in them.
Like watching them float by.
Kind of. Think of it like a camera just recording what's happening, thoughts, feelings, without getting attached, without judging. And here's a really vital point for you. Those negative emotions or tough experiences, they aren't you. they're temporary phenomena passing through.
So if I feel despair, that doesn't mean I am despair.
Precisely. You are the observer of the despair. Mindfulness helps create that little bit of space, that distance, so you're not completely consumed by it.
That seems like a really helpful shift in perspective.
It really is. And they also mentioned the value of having a supportive friend, or even just developing that kind of inner voice. They called it an inner microphone that reminds you of your worth, especially when you stumble.
Because it's so easy to focus on the negative, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We tend to zoom in on our mistakes or shortcomings and completely overlook all the good stuff, all the strengths we have.
That negativity bias is real. Okay, something else I found interesting was about being natural in interactions.
Yes. Thuy Min shared that story about her first chat with Taisi Min Nim. He basically encouraged her to just be natural, be comfortable, even if it meant not using the most formal, respectful language traditional might dictate.
So being real is more important than following rigid rules.
That was the idea. That genuine connection between two authentic people is actually more powerful, more meaningful than sticking to conventions just for the sake of it.
I like that. Being real, even if it's a bit messy. And what about dealing with criticism or negative feedback? How does that fit with authenticity?
The suggestion was to try and see it as information, data, not as a personal attack on who you are.
Okay, so learn from it if you can, but don't let it define you or force you into being someone you're not.
Exactly. Make adjustments if needed, but without compromising your core self.
Wow, there's so much practical wisdom in that conversation. Okay, so for you, listening right now, what are some things to take away from this deep dive? Where can you start?
Well, first off, maybe just take this as an invitation. Set aside some quiet time for yourself just to honestly check in. Am I feeling a bit off track right now, disconnected from my real self?
And asking yourself, is this feeling coming from inside me, or is it more about external pressures? Like, am I putting this on myself, or is it work, family, society?
Yeah, just getting curious about the source. And they offered some really simple, accessible ways to start reconnecting.
Like what?
Things like deliberately spending time alone, just with your thoughts, or really mindfully enjoying simple things, a cup of tea, looking at the window, noticing nature.
Taking a break from the noise.
Exactly. Maybe meditation, maybe reading something reflective, maybe just journaling or thinking about your life's path so far.
It's about consciously creating that space for yourself and maybe reflecting on those moments. When did you feel truly in charge of your choices?
Right, versus times you felt swept along. You could even ask yourself, like, what percentage of my life right now feels like mine? Truly self-directed.
That's a challenging question. And what about the roles we play?
Yeah, think about the different hats you wear: parent, employee, friend, partner. Do these roles feel like they align with your core self? Or do they sometimes feel like costumes?
And trying to remember, when did you last feel genuinely 100% authentic? Especially maybe with people close to you.
Mm-hmm. And if you feel you're not authentic now, can you trace back when that started? Was there a turning point?
Lots to reflect on there.
Yeah.
And that key reminder about difficult emotions.
Yes, please remember this. When sadness, anger, anxiety, whatever it is comes up, it's real, but it's not the whole of you. It's temporary.
Yep.
Practice just noticing it. Oh, there is anger. Not I am angry.
Create that space.
Yeah.
Observe it.
Exactly. And they suggested a simple daily practice, too.
What was that?
Just find a comfy spot, maybe near a window or outside if you can, and just observe. Look at a tree, the clouds, listen to the birds. Don't try to do anything. Just train yourself to be the quiet observer.
Practicing being the watcher, not the one caught up in the storm.
Beautifully put, yes. Training that observer muscle.
Some really powerful yet gentle ways to start this journey back to ourselves. It's definitely not always easy, but it sounds incredibly worthwhile.
Absolutely. And our genuine hope for you listening is that this deep dive has sparked some useful thoughts, maybe offered a starting point for your own journey of self-discovery.
Thanks so much for exploring this with us. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.